Historical Reconstruction of Aryan X. Episode 72. Agents of History Fabrication. 1. Paul Pelliot, the minion of history fabrication. The tribe called Magyar, which spanned from the southern Russian steppes to Hungary and Europe, was the Malgal, Mohe, of Korean history, and this Malgal was none other than Malgor, Mangor, and Mongol, whose phonemes were transformed and settled. In modern times, history was fabricated on a global scale, throwing our spirit and humanity's spirit into confusion. This stems from erasing the spirit and history of the Scythian Aryans of Central Asia, the subjects of this world's history, by force, and fabricating and establishing it on the current East Asian peninsula. Of course, since other fragments were mixed up and scattered here and there, one really cannot come to one's senses. They fabricated the real Mongols of the Russian steppes and overlaid them onto the Mongols north of the currently fabricated China and left clumsy artifacts, ruins, and documents roughly, fabricating history. To understand the real history of truth that existed worldwide, one must strike the weak link of Mongol history. The title of the Travels of Marco Polo, Dongbang Gyonmonrok, which Moule and Pelliot compiled and collated, is the description of the world. The Dongbang, or East, of Turkmenistan, Central Asia, that Marco Polo witnessed is precisely the world itself. That means they fabricated the history of the world. That means they fabricated history itself. That means they fabricated the memory and consciousness of all humanity itself. Aha! It means modern humanity has fallen into amnesia, schizophrenia, and delusional dream illusions. The research, restoration, and recovery of the history of Central Asia, which is the continental history, is research on world history and research on history itself. Its restoration and recovery are the only answers that can present proper alternatives to all sorts of symptoms of modern humanity. Weakness of the Travels of Marco Polo. Dongbang Gyonmonrok. In the process of artificially fabricating and creating the yellow race peril that blew into the West from the early 20th century, they created a fabricated drama stating the Tartars, that is, the yellow race in the current Mongolia of the East, invaded as far as Western Europe and committed cruel slaughter, destruction, and looting. By doing so, European society justified all kinds of demonic atrocities such as Western imperialism, colonization and semi-colonization, sabotage of self-determination, invasion, exploitation, looting, destruction, and ruthless military operations. They sought to persuade the legitimacy of their history fabrication and promote the maintenance of power for the European Western ruling class at the time. To fabricate history for such justification, they fabricated the Travels of Marco Polo as much as necessary for the basic fabrication of Jami al-Tawarik and the secret history of the Mongols, but the fabrication of the Travels of Marco Polo was not that easy. Since there were so many editions available, there were no experts who could touch up every nook and cranny. The edition that came out in 1938, roughly touched up and patched with sloppy annotations by Pelliot, who was known as the best Orientalist of the time, was Marco Polo, The Description of the World, London, George Routwitz Sons, Ltd., compiled and collated by A.C. Moule and P. Pelliot. With this edition as the base text, all of the Travels of Marco Polo published before it were either modified or discarded, and the Travels of Marco Polo after that were unified into this single edition. By adding some deletions and additions, they even pretended to have accumulated quite a bit of bibliographic data. The story of P. Pelliot is well described in Foreign Devils on the Silk Road by Peter Hopkirk. Pelliot was appointed as a professor of Chinese at the incredibly suspicious École Française des Trèmes Extrêmes in Hanoi, Vietnam at the young age of 22. A Chinology expert fluent in 13 languages went to Xinjiang, not the Xinjiang of the current fabricated China, but Turkmenistan, Central Asia and history in 1906 when he was 27, making a name for himself as the best artifact excavator and looter. In other words, he was the greatest devil among the foreign devils on the Silk Road. Pelliot, who was so smart and achieved great accomplishments, never returned to the Silk Road of Central Asia after this one exploration and looting trip. In a warehouse of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, refusing access to anyone, he only dug into the ancient manuscripts looted from Gyeongju and Dunhong, which are the documents of the Scythian Aryans of history, which are the documents of the Scythian Aryans of Central Asia in history, not the fabricated Dunhong of current China, but only Pelliot carried the key, and any access by others to the documents was denied. Of course, here all history books of Central Asia are manipulated and come out as fabricated editions. What is important here is that Sven Hedin, the author of The Silk Road, constantly traveled the Silk Road of Central Asia for 45 years, but Pelliot, who traveled the Silk Road only once, was famous for being too skilled, confident, and therefore daring, rash, and arrogant. Therefore, there are too many loopholes in the English edition of the Travels of Marco Polo that became the base text for all of the Travels of Marco Polo compiled and collated by Pelliot. If you examine the Travels of Marco Polo while comparing it with Jami al-Tawarikh, The Secret History of the Mongols, Great Tang Records on the Western Regions, and Memoir of the Pilgrimage to the Five Kingdoms of India, Wang O Chanchekjukguk, it becomes clearly visible which side is the fabrication. Even parts where the front and back of the Travels of Marco Polo itself contradict each other appear frequently, and it is clearly visible which part is the fabrication. Because the base text work for all history books and bibliographies related to Mongolia, Central Asia, West Asia, Russia, or India around the world could not proceed with the relevance to the Travels of Marco Polo, this base text had to come out by 1938, driven and chased by time. Therefore, it is visibly clear to the point of pity that they rushed to compile and collate it too hastily. If you look at the Travels of Marco Polo correctly, the so-called 25 histories of China are clearly the history of Korea. It becomes too clearly visible where the history of India, Central Asia, Persia, Arabia, and Russia is fabricated. This is precisely the whole of history fabrication. Although it was said that the Travels of Marco Polo was published in 1938, the actual year of publication is before 1926. Because the edition of the Book of Sir Marco Polo, AMS Press, Inc. Yule, Henry, 1926, was published modified to match exactly the Pelliot edition in 1926, it seems that the Pelliot edition was already out before that, and the edition was modified according to that original edition. In reality, it seems to have come out much earlier than that, and after the fabrication work of basic books was completed and published, the publication year was fabricated to 1938. The Travels of Marco Polo is a big mistake for Paul Pelliot, the giant of these history fabrication forces. It exposes the reality of the Mongol Empire, the reality of Korea, and the reality of half a myriad years of human history, piercing through all those fabrications and showing the inner flesh as it is. Is it a mistake of the genius Paul Pelliot? In my opinion, I strongly feel that he had a shred of conscience and opened it up so that we, the later generations, could see the truth of history as much as possible if we have the eyes to see history and only the mind to see it correctly. Or was it due to antipathy towards the fabrication forces forcing hasty work on top of hasty work? We must have all made this assumption once. If I were to fabricate history, how would I have done it? However, there is one very difficult point. The fabricator must have a thorough insight into the contents to fabricate. It is not their history, nor is it simple British history or history of Korea on the Korean peninsula, but the history of the whole world under heaven. It is a work that not one person, but thousands or tens of thousands of people must cling to. How can one establish a strategy to carry this out in a unified manner? What systems should be built? First, what should be the text to educate these numerous history fabricators? Wouldn't the fabricators first need to know the actual reality of the original history, A, to produce the fabricated result, B? They had to first create a scaffolding system, an auxiliary construction structure, which would be the basis for learning the actual reality of history A and building the basic structure of the fabricated result, B. That scaffolding was precisely Marco Polo's The Travels of Marco Polo, Great Tang Records on the Western Regions, Memoir of the Pilgrimage to the Five Kingdoms of India, Records on the Western Regions, The Secret History of the Mongols, Jami al-Tawarik, and Korea's geography book Sinjing Dongguk Yeji Sungnam. These were the study books for learning the history of the original Central Asian Turkmenistan edition. After this learning and the construction of fabricated history, once each individual regional history is completed, this scaffolding, the auxiliary structure of history fabrication, can be demolished or discarded. However, fortunately for us, they did not demolish or discard the truths of that history which are alive in parts, but left them standing together with the completed fabrication, roughly touched up to match the individual fabricated histories, although a bit shabby. Some parts of the truth of history completely match the completion, but some parts of the truth of history remain as the contents of the original. That the contents of the original remain as they are, that is precisely the whole in history fabrication. The planners of that history fabrication were confident because by the 1900s, Turkmenistan in Central Asia had already been destroyed and started to become desertified. Organization into Western regions was finished in each individual history, and it was neatly packaged as the Silk Road. If they just managed the artifacts that might pop out well, the disposal of that scaffolding would not be a problem at all. So, the whole world occasionally visits the romantic Silk Road where only deserts, a few oases, and a few ancient artifacts remain in Central Asia, which was the center of the past world, or sees it through books, movies, and TV. 2. Joseon History Compilation Committee, Joseon Sapyeonsu Hui, the agent of Korea and world history fabrication. 1. Abe Nobuyuki. I quote the words of Abe Nobuyuki, the last Governor-General of Korea from Japan, who fabricated the history of Scythian Aryans, the history of the world, as a collaborator of the British Empire. Quote, I guarantee that it will take much more than 100 years for Koreans to come to their senses and regain the glory of the brilliant and great old Korea, because we, Japan, have planted colonial education more terrifying than guns and cannons in Koreans. Eventually, they will live a slave-like life, alienating each other. Look, indeed, Korea was great and brilliant, but the current Korea has eventually fallen into a slave of colonial education. The beginning and end of the colonial slave education spoken by the Japanese fellow Abe Nobuyuki, the collaborator of the British Empire, is precisely history fabrication. 2. History fabrication. Joseon History Compilation Committee, Joseon Sapyeonsu Hui, the minion of Korea and world history fabrication. I quote from Dom Encyclopedia about the subject who created the history books of Korea that Koreans are currently learning. Quote, the Joseon History Compilation Committee, Joseon Sapyeonsu Hui, is an organization launched by expanding and strengthening the Committee for Compilation of Korean History, which was launched according to the regulations of the Committee for Compilation of Korean History, December 4, 1921, Instruction Number 64 of the Governor-General of Korea. The types and principles of business were determined at this time. The chairmanship of the Committee for Compilation of Korean History was concurrently held by the Administrative Superintendent of the Governor-General of Korea, and Lee Won-young, Park Young-hyo, Kwon Jong-hyun, etc. were appointed as advisors. The actual work was overseen by Kuroita Katsumi, a professor at Tokyo Imperial University, and Inaba Inakichi, a representative of the Manchurian Korean History View, Monshan Sagwan, supervised the compilation work. The main business of the Committee for Compilation of Korean History, which is Korean history, was the compilation of the history of Joseon and the collection of historical materials of Joseon for this purpose. The work order established a 10-year plan with collecting historical materials, compilation, contribution, and organizing drafts. Why did people called current Japanese create the history of Korea, another country? No, is this even allowed? Is it allowed for guys who have no relation to that history to make the history of another country as they please like this? This is the reality of the history of Korea, no, the whole world that you currently know. Of course, the history of your motherlands was also fabricated simultaneously during this period. It is a problem for all of us, the Scythian Aryans. It is the 105th year this year since the subjects who fabricated the history of the Scythian Aryans, the history of the world, were created. Already 4 generations have passed, and it seems impossible to reveal the truth of history now, but it seems it is time to wake up and find our true appearance. All you Scythian Aryans who are watching this broadcast and reading the book, isn't it time to see our true appearance now? Your ancestors were truly wonderful people. Now I will start the journey to find the truth of your wonderful ancestors. In the next episode, I will summarize from the origin of humanity to the era of J.J. Ilchi as unity of religion and politics, and from the episode after that, we will enter the era of J.J. Boonley as separation of religion and politics. Please refer to the attached blog for details regarding the YouTube video release schedule and the titles and the table of contents of the prepared book. blog.naver.com/GoKimGarcia